In a world shaped by power and poverty, one man emerged to defy the odds and transform a nation. Thomas Sankara, a soldier, a revolutionary, a visionary, dared to reimagine his country's destiny. Born on December 21, 1949, in the land then called Upper Volta, Sankara grew from humble beginnings to lead a movement that would rewrite the course of his people's history. From his rise to power in 1983 to his tragic assassination, just 4 years later, Sankara's dream of a self-reliant, united Africa captivated the world. He named his country Burkina Faso, the land of incorruptible people, and with bold reforms he ignited the spirit of Pan-Africanism, challenging imperialism and embracing change. Stay tuned as we bring you the full documentary of Thomas Sankara, only in Supreme News. Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara, born on December 21, 1949, and assassinated on October 15, 1987, was a Burkinabe military officer, Marxist revolutionary, and dedicated Pan-Africanist. He took office as president of Burkina Faso following a coup in 1983 and held the position until his assassination in 1987. In 1983, after being appointed prime minister, Sankara's disagreements with the ruling government led to his imprisonment. While he remained under house arrest, a group of revolutionaries with strong public support took control in a coup on his behalf later that year. At just 33 years old, Sankara became president of the Republic of Upper Volta and initiated a groundbreaking array of social, environmental, and economic reforms. In 1984, he led the effort to rename the nation Burkina Faso, meaning land of incorruptible people, with its citizens known as Burkinabe or upright people. His foreign policy focused on anti-imperialism, rejecting loans and funding from organizations like the International Monetary Fund. However, he did accept selective foreign aid to stimulate the domestic economy, diversify support sources, and advance Burkina Faso's journey towards self-sufficiency. His domestic policies included famine prevention, agrarian expansion, land reform, and suspending rural poll taxes, as well as a nationwide literacy campaign and vaccination program to reduce meningitis, yellow fever, and measles. Sankara's health programs distributed millions of doses of vaccines to children across Burkina Faso. His government also focused on building schools, health centers, water reservoirs, and infrastructure projects. He combated desertification of the Sahel by planting more than 10 million trees. Socially, his government enforced the prohibition of female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and polygamy. Sankara reinforced his populist image by ordering the sale of luxury vehicles and properties owned by the government in order to reduce costs. In addition, he banned what he considered the luxury of air conditioning in government offices and homes of politicians. He established Cuban-inspired committees for the defense of the revolution to serve as a new foundation of society and promote popular mobilization. His popular revolutionary tribunals prosecuted public officials charged with graft, political crimes, and corruption, considering such elements of the state counter-revolutionaries. This led to criticism by Amnesty International for human rights violations, including the government's practice of extrajudicial executions and arbitrary detentions of political opponents. Sankara's revolutionary initiatives and reforms promoting African self-reliance turned him into a symbol of hope for many impoverished African nations. He was widely admired by a large portion of Burkina Faso's population and by supporters beyond its borders. However, some of his policies alienated parts of the former ruling elite, including traditional tribal leaders, and strained relations with the governments of France and its ally Ivory Coast. On October 15, 1987, Sankara was assassinated by troops led by Blaise Compaoré, who assumed leadership of the country shortly thereafter. Compaoré retained power until the 2014 Burkina Faso uprising. In 2021, he was formally charged with and found guilty for the murder of Sankara by a military tribunal. Early life of Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara was born Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara on December 21, 1949 in Yako, French Upper Volta, as the third of 10 children to Joseph and Marguerite Sankara. His father, Joseph Sankara, a gendarme, was of mixed Mossi Fulani Silmi Moaga heritage, while his mother Marguerite Kinda was of direct Mossi descent. He spent his early years in Gawa, a town in the humid southwest to which his father was transferred as an auxiliary gendarme. As the son of one of the few African functionaries then employed by the colonial state, he enjoyed a relatively privileged position. The family lived in a brick house with the families of other gendarmes at the top of a hill overlooking the rest of Gawa. Sankara attended primary school at Bobo Dioulasso. He applied himself seriously to his schoolwork and excelled in mathematics and French. He went to church often, and impressed with his energy and eagerness to learn, some of the priests encouraged Thomas to go on to seminary school once he finished primary school. Despite initially agreeing, he took the exam required for entry to the 6th grade in the secular educational system and passed. Thomas's decision to continue with his education at the nearest lycée, Wezen Coulibaly, named after a pre-independence nationalist, proved to be a turning point. He left his father's household to attend the lycée in Bobo Dioulasso, the country's commercial center. There Sankara made close friends, including Fideli II, whom he later named a minister in his government, and Somain Touré, who was in a more advanced class. Although his Roman Catholic parents hoped he would become a priest, Sankara chose a military career instead. The military had gained popularity after ousting the unpopular President Mauricio Miogo, and many young intellectuals saw it as a national institution that could bring discipline to the inefficient and corrupt bureaucracy, limit the excessive power of traditional chiefs, and help modernize the nation. Admission to the military academy also came with a scholarship which was essential for Sankara, as he could not easily afford further education on his own. He took and passed the entrance exam, securing his place in the academy. He entered the military academy of Kadiogo in Ouagadougou with the academy's first intake of 1966 at the age of 17. While there, he witnessed the first military coup d'état in Upper Volta led by Lieutenant Colonel Senghol Amazana, January 3, 1966. The trainee officers were taught by civilian professors in the social sciences. Adama Touré, who taught history and geography, was the academic director at the time and known for having progressive ideas, although he did not publicly share them. He invited a few of his brightest and more political students, among them Sankara, to join informal discussions outside the classroom about imperialism, neo-colonialism, socialism and communism, the Soviet and Chinese revolutions, the liberation movements in Africa, and similar topics. This was the first time Sankara was systematically exposed to a revolutionary perspective on Upper Volta and the world. Aside from his academic and extracurricular political activities, Sankara also pursued his passion for music and played the guitar. In 1970, 20-year-old Sankara went for further military studies at the Military Academy of Ant Sirab in Madagascar, from which he graduated as a junior officer in 1973. At the Ant Sirab Academy, the range of instruction went beyond standard military subjects, which allowed Sankara to study agriculture, including how to raise crop yields and better the lives of farmers. He took up these issues in his own administration and country. During that period, he read profusely on history and military strategy, thus acquiring the concepts and analytical tools that he would later use in his reinterpretation of Burkinabe political history. Military career of Thomas Sankara. After his basic military training in secondary school in 1966, Sankara began his military career at the age of 19. A year later, he was sent to Madagascar for officer training at Ant Sirab, where he witnessed popular uprisings in 1971 and 1972 against the government of Philibert Tsiranana. During this period, he first read the works of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, which profoundly influenced his political views for the rest of his life. Returning to Upper Volta in 1972, he fought in a border war between Upper Volta and Mali by 1974. He earned fame for his performance in the conflict, but years later would renounce the fighting as useless and unjust, a reflection of his growing political consciousness. He also became a popular figure in the capital of Ouagadougou. Sankara was a decent guitarist. He played in a band named Taude Kujaz and rode a bicycle. In 1976, he became commander of the Commando Training Center in Peu. In the same year, he met Blaise Compaoré in Morocco. During the presidency of Colonel Say Zerbo, a group of young officers formed a secret organization called ROC, the best-known members being Henri Zongo, Jean-Baptiste Boukari Lingani, Blaise Compaoré, and Sankara. Government positions held by Thomas Sankara. In September 1981, Sankara was appointed Minister of Information in Say Zerbo's military government. He stood out from other officials by choosing to bike to work rather than use a car. Unlike his predecessors, who censored journalists and controlled the press, Sankara promoted investigative journalism and allowed the media to publish freely. This led to both privately owned and state-owned newspapers exposing government scandals. On April 12, 1982, he resigned in protest against what he saw as the regime's shift against labor interests, famously stating, "Misfortune to those who gag the people." After another coup, November 7, 1982, brought to power Major Dr. Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, Sankara became prime minister in January 1983. But he was dismissed a few months later on May 17th. During those 4 months, Sankara pushed Ouedraogo's regime for more progressive reforms. Sankara was arrested after the French president's African affairs advisor, Guy Pene, met with Colonel Yuan Sum, Henri Zongo, and Jean-Baptiste Boukari Lingani were also placed under arrest. The decision to arrest Sankara proved to be very unpopular with the younger officers in the military regime. His imprisonment created enough momentum for his friend Blaise Compaoré to lead another coup. Thomas Sankara Presidency, a coup d'état organized by Blaise Compaoré, made Sankara president on August 4, 1983 at the age of 33. The coup d'état was supported by Libya, which was at the time on the verge of war, with France in Chad. Sankara identified as a revolutionary and was inspired by the examples of Cuba's Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and Ghana's military leader Jerry Rawlings. As president, he promoted the democratic and popular revolution. The ideology of the revolution was defined by Sankara as anti-imperialist in a speech on October 2, 1983. His policy was oriented toward fighting corruption and promoting reforestation. On August 4, 1984, the first anniversary of his accession, he renamed the country Burkina Faso, meaning the land of upright people, in Moor and Dioula, the two major languages of the country. He also gave it a new flag and wrote a new national anthem. Council of the Revolution. Upon assuming power on August 4th, Sankara established the Council of the Revolution, CNR, as the country's new leadership body, signaling his commitment to pursuing political and social transformation. The CNR included both civilians and soldiers, representing everyday people. For security reasons, the exact number of members was kept confidential, known only to Sankara and those within his inner circle. The CNR regularly met to talk about important plans and decisions for the country. They helped give advice and direction to the government's actions. They voted on suggestions and decisions from government's officials. The decision-making was collective. On some occasions, they overruled even proposals favored personally by Sankara. Healthcare and public works. Sankara's first priorities after taking office were feeding, housing, and giving medical care to his people who desperately needed it. Sankara launched a mass vaccination program in an attempt to eradicate polio, meningitis, and measles. From 1983 to 1985, 2 million Burkinabe were vaccinated. Prior to Sankara's presidency, infant mortality in Burkina Faso was about 20.8%. During his presidency, it fell to 14.5%. Sankara's administration was the first African government to publicly recognize the AIDS epidemic as a major threat to Africa. Large-scale housing and infrastructure projects were also undertaken. Brick factories were created to help build houses in an effort to end urban slums. In an attempt to fight deforestation, the People's Harvest of Forest Nurseries was created to supply 7,000 village nurseries, as well as organizing the planting of several million trees. All regions of the country were soon connected by a vast road and rail building program. Over 700 kilometers, 430 miles, of rail was laid by Burkinabe people to facilitate manganese extraction in the Battle of the Rails without any foreign aid or outside money. These programs were an attempt to prove that African countries could be prosperous without foreign help or aid. Sankara also launched education programs to help combat the country's 90% illiteracy rate. These programs saw a great success. Shortly after the assassination of Sankara, wide-scale teacher strikes, coupled with the new regime's unwillingness to negotiate, led to the creation of revolutionary teachers. In an attempt to replace the nearly 2,500 teachers fired over a strike in 1996, anyone with a college degree was invited to teach through the Revolutionary Teachers Program. Volunteers received a 10 days training course before beginning to teach. Thomas Sankara on agriculture. In the 1980s, over 90% of the population were still agrarian farmers. However, less than 6% of irrigable land was actually irrigated, leaving most crops dependent on rain, which was often scarce and unreliable. Only about 10% of the population owned animals for plowing, while most had to rely on individual handheld hoes for cultivation. Livestock herders also faced challenges as few had access to adequate fodder and had to constantly move across the countryside in search of grazing areas and water. As a result, hunger was widespread, and during droughts, rural communities were at severe risk of famine. In Sankara's 5-year plan, some 71% of projected investments for the productive sectors were allocated to agriculture, livestock, fishing, wildlife, and forests. In 3 years, 25% more land was irrigated because of volunteer projects. In Suru Valley, a dam was built within a few months, almost entirely by volunteer labor. The use of fertilizers increased by 56%. Hundreds of tractors were bought and imported for large-scale cooperative projects. Hundreds of village cereal banks were built through collective labor organized by the CDRs to help farmers store and market their crops. In the past, farmers would have no way to store surplus grains and had to sell them to local merchants who would sell the same crops back to the same village for twice the cost. In August 1984, all land was nationalized. Previously, local chiefs had decided who could farm. In some areas, private land ownership had begun to arise. The total cereal production rose by 75% between 1983 and 1986. In 4 years, UN analysts declared Burkinian agriculture as productive enough to be food self-sufficient. Thomas Sankara environment policies. In the 1980s, when ecological awareness was still very low, Thomas Sankara was one of the few African leaders to consider environmental protection a priority. He engaged in 3 major battles: against bushfires, which will be considered as crimes and will be punished as such; against cattle roaming, which infringes on the rights of peoples because unattended animals destroy nature; and against the chaotic cutting of firewood, whose profession will have to be organized and regulated. As part of a development program involving a large part of the population, 10 million trees were planted in Burkina Faso in 15 months during the revolution. To face the advancing desert and recurrent droughts, Thomas Sankara also proposed planting wooded strips of about 50 kilometers, crossing the country from east to west. He thought of extending this vegetation belt to other countries. Beginning in October 1984, over the space of 15 months, Sankara's government planted 10 million trees in a campaign of reforestation. Sankara said, "In Burkina, wood is our only source of energy. We have to constantly remind every individual of his duty to maintain and regenerate nature." People's Revolutionary Tribunals. Shortly after attaining power, Sankara constructed a system of courts known as the Popular Revolutionary Tribunal. The courts were created originally to try former government officials in a straightforward way, so the average Burkinabe could participate in or oversee trials of enemies of the revolution. They placed defendants on trial for corruption, tax evasion, or counter-revolutionary activity. Sentences for former government officials were light and often suspended. The tribunals have been alleged to have been only show trials held very openly with oversight from the public. The U.S. State Department reported that the trials did not meet international legal standards, particularly in terms of protecting the rights of the accused. Defendants were required to prove their innocence rather than having the prosecution prove their guilt, and they were not permitted legal representation. Initially, the courts were highly regarded by the Burkinabe people, but over time, they became seen as corrupt and oppressive. Individuals labeled as lazy workers were put on trial, sentenced to forced labor, or dismissed from their jobs and subjected to discrimination. In some cases, people took matters into their own hands, setting up unofficial courts to settle personal scores and humiliate their perceived enemies. Thomas Sankara Revolutionary Defense Committees, the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, Comites de Défense de la Révolution, or CDRs, were formed as mass-armed organizations. The CDRs were created as a counterweight to the power of the army, as well as to promote political and social revolution. The idea for the Revolutionary Defense Committees was taken from Cuban leader Fidel Castro, whose Committees for the Defense of the Revolution had been created as a form of revolutionary vigilance. Thomas Sankara relations with the Mossi people. A point of contention regarding Sankara's rule is the way he handled the Mossi ethnic group. The Mossi are the largest ethnic group in Burkina Faso, and they adhere to a strict, traditional, hierarchical social systems. At the top of the hierarchy is the Moro Naba, the chief or king of the Mossi people. Sankara viewed this arrangement as an obstacle to national unity and proceeded to demote the Mossi elite. The Moro Naba was not allowed to hold courts. Local village chiefs were stripped of their executive powers, which were given to the CDR. Women's rights under Thomas Sankara. Sankara had extensively worked for women's rights and declared there is no true social revolution without the liberation of women. Improving women's status in Burkinabe society was one of Sankara's explicit goals, and his government included a large number of women, an unprecedented policy priority in West Africa. His government banned female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and polygamy, while appointing women to high governmental positions and encouraging them to work outside the home and stay in school even if pregnant. Sankara promoted contraception, and in 1986, all restrictions on contraception were removed. He also established a Ministry of Family Development and the Union of Burkina Women. Sankara recognized the challenges faced by African women when he gave his famous address to mark International Women's Day on March 8, 1987 in Ouagadougou. Sankara spoke to thousands of women, saying that the Burkinabe Revolution was establishing new social relations, which would be upsetting the relations of authority between men and women and forcing each to rethink the nature of both. This task is formidable but necessary. In addition to being the first African leader to appoint women to major cabinet positions, he recruited them actively for the military. Thomas Sankara on Agacher Strip War. Following the 1974 clashes between Burkina Faso and Mali over the disputed territory of the Agacher Strip, the Organization of African Unity had created a mediation commission to resolve the disagreement and provide for an independent, neutral demarcation of the border. Both governments had declared that they would not use armed force to end the dispute. But by 1983, the two countries disagreed about the work of the commission. Sankara personally disliked Malian President Moussa Traoré, who had taken power by deposing Modibo Keïta's left-leaning regime. On September 17th, Sankara visited Mali and met with Traoré. With Algerian mediation, the two agreed to have the border dispute settled by the International Court of Justice, ICJ, and subsequently petitioned the body to resolve the issue. In July 1985, Burkina Faso declared the Malian Secretary-General of the Economic Community of West Africa, Idrissa Keïta, a persona non grata after he criticized Sankara's regime. In September, Sankara delivered a speech in which he called for a revolution in Mali. Malian leaders were particularly sensitive to the inflammatory rhetoric, as their country was undergoing social unrest. Around the same time, Sankara and other key figures in the CNR became convinced that Traoré was harboring opposition to the Burkinabe regime in Bamako and plotting to provoke a border war. which would be used to support a counter-revolution. Tensions at the border began to rise on November 24th when one Burkinabe national killed another near the border in Somme province. Malian police crossed the boundary to arrest the murderer and also detained several members of a local committee for the defense of the revolution who were preparing a tribunal. 3 days later, Malian police entered Kounia to restore order. Burkina Faso made diplomatic representations on the incidents to Mali, but was given no formal response. At the beginning of December, Burkina Faso informed Mali and other surrounding countries that it was conducting its decennial national census from 10 to December 20th. On December 14th, military personnel entered the Agacher to assist with the census. Mali accused the military authorities of pressuring Malian citizens in border villages to register with the census, a charge which Burkina Faso disputed. In an attempt to reduce tensions, ANAD, a West African treaty organization, dispatched a delegation to Bamako and Ouagadougou to mediate. President of Algeria, Chadli Benjedid, contacted Sankara and Traoré to encourage a peaceful resolution. At the request of ANAD members, Burkina Faso announced the withdrawal of all military personnel from the disputed region. Despite the declared withdrawal, a war of the communiques ensued as Burkinabe and Malian authorities exchanged hostile messages. Feeling threatened by Sankara, Traoré began preparing Mali for hostilities with Burkina Faso. 3 groupments were formed and planned to invade Burkina Faso and converge on the city of Bobo Dioulasso. Once there, they would rally Burkinabe opposition forces to take Ouagadougou and overthrow Sankara. Former Sankara aide Paul Michaud wrote that Sankara had intended to provoke Mali into conflict with the aim of mobilizing popular support for his regime. According to Michaud, an official and reliable Malian source had reported that mobilization documents dating to December 19th were found on the bodies of fallen Burkinabe soldiers during the ensuing war. Sankara's efforts to provide evidence of his bona fides were systematically undermined. It is hard to believe that the Malian authorities are unaware that the rumors circulating are false, says U.S. Ambassador Leonardo Nair. In contrast to Michaud's assertion, the Central Intelligence Agency CIA cable states the war was born of Bamako's hope that the conflict would trigger a coup in Burkina Faso. At dawn on December 25, 1985, about 150 Malian army tanks crossed the frontier and attacked several locations. Malian troops also attempted to envelop Bobo Dioulasso in a pincer attack. The Burkina Faso army struggled to repel the offensive in the face of superior Malian firepower and were overwhelmed on the northern front. Malian forces quickly secured the towns of Dianoga, Selba, Kuna, and Duna in the Agacher. The Burkinabe government in Ouagadougou received word of hostilities at about 1 p.m. and immediately issued mobilization orders. Various security measures were also imposed across the country, including nighttime blackouts. Burkinabe forces regrouped in the Dianoga area to counterattack. Captain Compere took command of this western front. Under his leadership, soldiers split into small groups and employed guerrilla tactics against Malian tanks. Immediately after hostilities began, other African leaders attempted to institute a truce. On the morning of December 30th, Burkina Faso and Mali agreed to an ANAD-brokered ceasefire. By then, Mali had occupied most of the Agacher Strip. More than 100 Burkinabe and approximately 40 Malian soldiers and civilians were killed during the war. The Burkinabe towns of Waheguya, Djibo, and Nassambu were left badly damaged by the fighting. At an ANAD summit in Yamoussoukro on January 17, 1987, Traoré and Sankara met and formalized an agreement to end hostilities. The ICJ later split the Agacher. Mali received the more densely populated western portion and Burkina Faso the eastern section, centered on the Beli River. Both countries indicated their satisfaction with the judgment. Burkina Faso declared that the war was part of an international plot to bring down Sankara's government. It rejected speculation that it was fought over rumored mineral wealth in the Agacher. The country's relatively poor performance in the conflict damaged the domestic credibility of the CNR. Some Burkinabe soldiers were angered by Sankara's failure to prosecute the war more aggressively and rally a counteroffensive against Mali. The conflict also demonstrated the country's weak international position and forced the CNR to craft a more moderate image of its policies and goals abroad. In the aftermath, the Burkinabe government made little reference to supporting revolution in other countries, and its relations with France modestly improved. At a rally held after the war, Sankara conceded that his country's military was not adequately armed and announced the commutation of sentences for numerous political prisoners. Thomas Sankara's relations with other countries. Thomas Sankara defined his program as anti-imperialist. In this respect, France became the main target of revolutionary rhetoric. When President François Mitterrand visited Burkina Faso in November 1986, Sankara criticized the French for having received Peter Botha, the Prime Minister of South Africa, which still enforced apartheid, and Jonas Savimbi, the leader of UNITA in France, referring to both men as covered in blood from head to toe. In response, France reduced its economic aid to Burkina Faso by 80% between 1983 and 1985. Guy Pene, President Mitterrand's advisor on African affairs, organized a media campaign in France to denigrate Thomas Sankara in collaboration with the DGSE. It provided the press with a series of documents on supposed atrocities intended to feed articles against him. Sankara set up a program of cooperation with Cuba. After meeting with Fidel Castro, Sankara arranged to send young Burkinabes to Cuba in September 1986 to receive professional training and to participate in the country's development upon their return. These were volunteers recruited on the basis of a competition. Priority was given to orphans and young people from rural and disadvantaged areas. Some 600 teenagers were flown to Cuba to complete their schooling and receive professional training to become doctors, particularly gynecologists, engineers, or agronomists. Denouncing the support of the United States to Israel and South Africa, he called on African countries to boycott the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. At the United Nations General Assembly, he denounced the invasion of Grenada by the United States. The latter nation responded by implementing trade sanctions against Burkina Faso. Also at the UN, Sankara called for an end to the veto power granted to the great powers. In the name of the right of peoples to sovereignty, he supported the national demands of the Western Sahara, Palestine, the Nicaraguan Sandinistas, and the South African ANC. While he had good relations with Ghanaian leader Jerry Rawlings and Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, Sankara was relatively isolated in West Africa. Leaders close to France, such as Houphouët Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire and Hassan II in Morocco, were particularly hostile to him. Thomas Sankara's criticism. The British development organization Oxfam recorded the arrest of trade union leaders in 1987. In 1984, 7 individuals associated with the previous regime in Burkina Faso were accused of treason and executed after a summary trial. Non-governmental organizations and unions were harassed or placed under the authority of the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, branches of which were established in each workplace and which functioned as organs of political and social control. 3 days after Sankara had assumed power in 1983 through the Popular Revolution, the National Union of African Teachers of Upper Volta, SNEV, called Sankara and his government fascist and called upon workers to be ready to fight for their freedom. As a result, the government ordered the arrest of 4 key figures of the SNEV. One was released shortly after. In response, the SNEV called upon a national teachers' strike to protest the arrests. The government saw this as something that endangered the politically weak Upper Volta, which had already faced 5 coups since its independence. Therefore, the Minister for National Education called upon directors of private schools not to use the services of the strikers in their establishments. The call affected 1,300 to 1,500 teachers. Popular revolutionary tribunals, set up by the government throughout the country, placed defendants on trial for corruption, tax evasion, or counter-revolutionary activity. Procedures in these trials, especially legal protections for the accused, did not conform to international standards. According to Christian Morrison and Jean-Paul Ozum of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the climate of urgency and drastic action, in which many punishments were carried out immediately against those who had the misfortune to be found guilty of unrevolutionary behavior, bore some resemblance to what occurred in the worst days of the French Revolution during the Reign of Terror. Although few people were killed, violence was widespread. Death of Thomas Sankara. On October 15, 1987, Sankara and 12 other officials were killed in a coup d'état organized by his former colleague Blaise Compaoré. When accounting for his overthrow, Compaoré stated that Sankara jeopardized foreign relations with former colonial power France and neighboring Ivory Coast, and accused his former comrade of plotting to assassinate opponents. Prince Johnson, a former Liberian warlord allied to Charles Taylor and killer of the Liberian President Samuel Doe, whose last hours of life were filmed, told Liberia's Truth and Reconciliation Commission that it was engineered by Charles Taylor. After the coup, and although Sankara was known to be dead, some CDRs mounted an armed resistance to the army for several days. According to Helena Traoré, the sole survivor of Sankara's assassination, Sankara was attending a meeting with the Conseil de l'Entente. His assassins singled out Sankara and executed him. The assassins then shot at those attending the meeting, killing 12 other people. Sankara's body was riddled with bullets to the back, and he was quickly buried in an unmarked grave while his widow Mariam and 2 children fled the nation. Compaoré immediately reversed the nationalizations, overturned nearly all of Sankara's policies, rejoined the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to bring in desperately needed funds to restore the shattered economy, and ultimately spurned most of Sankara's legacy. Compaoré's dictatorship remained in power for 27 years until it was overthrown by popular protests in 2014. Trial. In 2017, the Burkina Faso government officially asked the French government to release military documents on the killing of Sankara after his widow accused France of masterminding his assassination. In April 2021, 34 years after Sankara's assassination, former President Compaoré and 13 others were indicted for complicity in the murder of Sankara as well as other crimes in the coup. This development came as part of President Roch Kaboré's framework of national reconciliation. In October 2021, the trial against Compaoré and 13 others began in Ouagadougou, with Compaoré being tried in absentia. Ex-presidential security chief Hyacinthe Kafando was also tried in absentia. A week before the trial, Compaoré's lawyers stated that he wouldn't be attending the trial, which they characterized as having defects, and also emphasized his privilege for immunity, being the former head of state. After requests made by the defense attorneys for more time to prepare their defense, the hearing was postponed until March 1st. On April 6th, 2022, Compaoré and 2 others were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison in absentia. 8 others were sentenced to between 3 and 20 years in prison. 3 were found innocent. Exhumation. The exhumation of what are believed to be the remains of Sankara started on African Liberation Day, May 25, 2015. Permission for an exhumation was denied during the rule of his successor, Blaise Compaoré. The exhumation would allow the family to formally identify the remains, a long-standing demand of his family and supporters. In October 2015, one of the lawyers for Sankara's widow Mariam reported that the autopsy revealed that Sankara's body was riddled with more than a dozen bullets. Thomas Sankara's legacy. Accompanying his personal charisma, Sankara had an array of original initiatives that contributed to his popularity and brought some international media attention to his government. Sankara's solidarity. He sold off the government fleet of Mercedes cars and made the Renault 5, the cheapest car sold in Burkina Faso at that time, the official service car of the ministers. He reduced the salaries of well-off public servants, including his own, and forbade the use of government chauffeurs and first-class airline tickets. He opposed foreign aid, saying that he who feeds you controls you, He spoke in forums like the Organization of African Unity against what he described as neo-colonialist penetration of Africa through Western trade and finance. He called for a united front of African nations to repudiate their foreign debt. He argued that the poor and exploited did not have an obligation to repay money to the rich and exploiting. In Ouagadougou, Sankara converted the army's provisioning store into a state-owned supermarket open to everyone, the first supermarket in the country. He forced well-off civil servants to pay 1 month's salary to public projects. He refused to use the air conditioning in his office on the grounds that such luxury was not available to anyone but a handful of Burkinabes. As president, he lowered his salary to $450 a month and limited his possessions to a car, 4 bikes, 3 guitars, a refrigerator, and a broken freezer. Thomas Sankara's style. He required public servants to wear a traditional tunic woven from Burkinabe cotton and sewn by Burkinabe craftsmen. He was known for jogging unaccompanied through Ouagadougou in his tracksuit and posing in his tailored military fatigues with his mother-of-pearl pistol. When asked why he did not want his portrait hung in public places, as was the norm for other African leaders, Sankara replied, "There are 7 million Thomas Sankaras." An accomplished guitarist, he wrote the new national anthem himself. A statue of Sankara was unveiled in 2019 at the location in Ouagadougou where he was assassinated. However, due to complaints that it did not match his facial features, a new statue was unveiled a year later. In 2023, the government of Burkina Faso formally proclaimed Sankara as a hero of the nation. In October 2023, on the 36th anniversary of his assassination, the government changed a main road name in Ouagadougou to honor Sankara. The road in question was the Boulevard Charles de Gaulle, now known as Boulevard Capitaine Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara. Thomas Sankara's international recognition. Cuba awarded Sankara with the highest honor of the state, the Order of José Martí. 20 years after his assassination, Sankara was commemorated on October 15, 2007 in ceremonies that took place in Burkina Faso, Mali, Senegal, Niger, Tanzania, Burundi, France, Canada, and the United States. Africa's Che Guevara. Sankara is often referred to as Africa's Che Guevara. Sankara gave a speech marking and honoring the 20th anniversary of Che Guevara's October 9, 1967 execution, 1 week before his own assassination on October 15, 1987. Ernesto Che Guevara was an Argentine Marxist revolutionary, physician, author, guerrilla leader, diplomat, and military theorist. A major figure of the Cuban Revolution, his stylized visage has become a ubiquitous counter-cultural symbol of rebellion and global insignia in popular culture. Thomas Sankara's vision lives on, a beacon for Africa and a challenge to injustice around the world. Though his life was cut short, his ideals, equality, self-sufficiency, and liberation remain alive in the hearts of millions. His story is not just that of one man, but of a people's resilience and a continent's unyielding desire for freedom. Today, Burkina Faso remembers Sankara not only as a leader, but as a symbol of courage and integrity, inspiring future generations to dream, fight, and build a better world. Please make sure you subscribe to Supreme News for more documentary and news update. Thank you.